This is Mark Tooley, editor of Providence, a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy, with the pleasure today of talking to Elbridge Colby, former assistant assistant secretary, I'm not able to say that correctly, of the Department of Defense. You can correct me, and also a co-founder of the Marathon Initiative. And I'm going to start out asking him about his very insightful and provocative article in Foreign Affairs, suggesting that ideology should not play a major role in America's strategic competition with communist China. So, Bridge, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Mark. Happy to be here and talk to you.
And since I was unable to say it, what exactly was your title at the Defense Department?
Yeah, it's like one of those Monty Python titles. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development. So it's a mouthful.
And after you left the Defense Department, you co-founded the Marathon Initiative. What is that?
Sure. It's a small new think tank I've co-founded with my partner and good friend Wes Mitchell, which is focused on developing strategies for this new era of great power competition. So it's a non-profit think tank.
And this article that you co-wrote for Foreign Affairs on ideology and our strategic competition with China, it seems counterintuitive to many Americans who reflexively would prioritize the ideological differences between American democracy and authoritarian China, but you make some very different points.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think ideology is a reality that is part of this dynamic. And actually, I think the government in Beijing may see ideology as a very important part of this competition. Our point of view, and certainly my point of view, I mean, I think I can speak for Bob Kaplan as well, is that Americans should not see this competition as primarily being about ideology. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is that fundamentally what we as Americans need to try to do is to ensure open and free access to trading and engaging in the world's largest market. It's important to keep our eye on that, because if we set our sights sort of much higher, or sort of in a more thoroughgoing way try to change China's ideology, that really raises the stakes in a competition that already is going to be very dangerous and intense. The phrase used, it's a little bit, maybe a little bit informal, it could turn it more into an existential cage match, which is to say make the competition with China more dangerous even than it already will be. The second reason, if I go through them, is that the more that this competition is framed as being really about ideology, there are a couple of consequences that might not be obvious, but we could see in the history of the Cold War in particular. One is that it will tend to make it a lot harder to work with countries that are themselves not democracies or are not model democracies. And this is particularly important because this is the case with really probably the majority of the important states in Asia. As we put it in the piece, it doesn't help us a lot if we have the Netherlands along for the ride, but we're unable to work, or we've alienated, say, Vietnam, which is of course a communist country, India, which while a democracy gets dinged by places like Freedom House for some of its internal governance issues, as well as really pretty much almost all of the countries of Southeast Asia. Singapore is a kind of quasi-democracy. Thailand is currently under a military government, and so forth and so on. So we got to be careful about that. Another reason is that the more it's seen as an ideological competition between the United States and China, the more it turns even sort of fundamentally peripheral contests into sort of tests of the system, and therefore it can kind of seem to amplify the importance of things that could otherwise be let go. And this is, of course, I'm thinking about Vietnam in particular here, where, I think part of what drove us into such a major investment into something that at the end of the day was not necessary to prevail in the Cold War was a sense that the sort of system was at issue and that everything was kind of interconnected. And I think that's something that we really want to be careful about moderating. So that's kind of how we see it. And I think the reason that we wrote it was we see a rising tendency really across the political spectrum, actually, to see things as primarily ideological. And I emphasize again that this is not incompatible with understanding that the Chinese may see things as in an ideological prism, for instance, even Xi Jinping himself. But it's really more about how we, sort of assess and calculate what we need to do and what we don't need to do, and who we can work with and who we can't work with as we go forward. In fact, just on that point, there was a Wall Street Journal piece today about a future Biden administration, kind of emphasizing potential Biden administration, saying that, in a lot of ways there would be continuity. But one of the quotes from Biden's advisors, one of Vice President Biden's advisors, was saying, the world is sorting into a competition of techno-democracies and techno-autocracies. And that's exactly the kind of thinking that we want to complicate, to use an academic term.
Now, obviously, ideology played a major role in the Cold War competition with the Soviet Union. How is our competition with China different from that with the Soviet Union?
Well, I mean, I actually, in some ways, I do think we're in a new Cold War. I mean, frankly, people say, oh my gosh, the old Cold War was so terrible. And I think to myself, well, if you compare it to the resolution of other major strategic great power competitions, it was actually pretty great. I mean, we avoided major war and the other side ended up giving up. Of course, the Chinese are very attuned to the lessons, and Xi Jinping himself, in fact, ordered, I think, Communist Party cadres around China to watch videos on how to avoid what happened to the Soviet Union in the 1980s. So they look at that as an object lesson. I think, in a sense, the analogy that we make in the piece, and that I would have taken, I think, if I were at the time, is a hardline position in a lot of ways, but less ideological than, say, for instance, the famous document NSC 68 of the Truman administration, which, if you go back and you look at it, is very much seen as an expansive, system-wide ideological contest. And not to say that Soviet communism wasn't loathsome, it was, and it was an evil empire in very important respects. But actually, I think one of the best proofs to show why it was not primarily ideological itself was the fact that we still have problems with Russia, actually. I mean, in a sense, we did what somebody would want if you see the competition as primarily ideological, and yet here we are with relationship worse than with Moscow than it was probably certainly in the late 1980s, ironically. So, I actually think to put a fine point on it, even if China became a democracy, we would still have many of the same concerns and probably problems that we have today.
Is it fair to say that you sound a little bit like George Kennan in the 1940s, warning that Russia is Russia regardless of who its rulers are?
Yeah, I think, well, Kennan was kind of an erratic and sometimes, he was a brilliant and perceptive, but also I think somewhat erratic and frankly unreliable thinker. But I'm certainly closer to that and the thought of like Hans Morgenthau. And in some ways, I would say the political figures would be people more like President Eisenhower and President Nixon and so forth. I mean, I think one thing to clearly differentiate is that I'm in this sort of school of wanting to see things as less ideological than others, but that's distinct about the hard line, soft line. It's not like I'm actually not, I mean, right now, in fact, I'm quite hardline on China. But I think, given the circumstances and conditions, but if you think about things in more ideological terms, your goals tend to be far more maximalist. And so I think it prevents the possibility for a détente later on if we get into a good position. Whereas I think what I'm talking about, what Bob and I are talking about, there would be a readiness to deal with the Chinese, but from a position of strength, or I should say, certainly with the Chinese, but even with the Chinese Communist Party dominated China, so long as they respect our interests. Now, I think that would be a different model than we pursued in the 90s and the 2000s, which was a kind of liberal, in the sort of true sense model, which was engagement in the hopes of changing China. That's not what I'm talking about. I mean, it might happen, but really it would be, look, there are going to be clear lines and walls and rules of the road. And if China doesn't respect them, they're going to meet a forceful counter response from us and those who share our interests in this, in setting those rules and boundaries. But if they do change their sort of calculus and behavior and in a way that's credible and verifiable in a sense, then we should be prepared to deal with them. And I think that's a little bit different than the détente approach of Nixon and Kissinger. I mean, Kissinger is such a fraught and sort of complicated figure, but I think there was always in the détente approach the sort of weary Titan aspect of Kissinger's assessment, and to some extent President Nixon's. I don't think that's what I'm talking about. I'm actually talking about détente from a position of strength, being open to it if the Chinese change their approach. But clearly Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership of today, at least, needs to be chastened, and they need to be shown that a more assertive and aggressive approach is not going to pay off.
And do you yourself identify as a realist with some qualifications?
Yeah, I would describe myself as a sort of a conservative realist. I mean, I think realism has to some extent been hijacked, particularly in the academy. I mean, obviously there's phenomenal work being done there, but I think realism in the last couple of decades has become more about the pursuit for a parsimonious explanation of international relations, because that's what the academy prizes. I mean, with Kenneth Waltz being the most famous exponent of that. And then in practice, in its political manifestation, is also often more akin to libertarianism, frankly, than conservatism. I mean, I think if conservatism means anything, it means a recognition of, the limits of what can, be transformed in the international environment, the propensity for bad outcomes and bad behavior if they're not penalized, and if there's not credible deterrent and counterforce available. So, I mean, I look back to sort of the more classical realism of I mentioned Morgenthau and the people kind of around that school, and you still saw until a few decades ago people like Robert Gilpin. But I think that kind of realism, you absolutely have to be active in the international environment, because the notion that if we just kind of retrench and come home and then everything will be fine and dandy overseas, I don't see how that's cognate with a sort of a realistic kind of conservative approach to order and the potential for anarchy and bad outcomes. I do think we need to be much more selective and focused and strategic in our outlook. I mean, so it's very different from the views of President Clinton, or for that matter, President George W. Bush, which is, I would see as more of a liberal approach in the sort of Gladstone sense, if you will. But mine is, more. I guess you could, look back at some of the Gladstone's opponents. I'd probably get into trouble with historians if I try to take the analogy too far. But yeah, I would put myself in that camp.
And would realism, as it did with the Soviet Union, imply that we would potentially cede to China a certain sphere of influence?
Yeah, I mean, spheres of influence are. I mean, it's a fraught term. I mean, I think where a lot of the debate comes into is what I would say is that realism, certainly you recognize the fact of other powerful states' power, and the fact that will have implications for the international environment. So, spheres of influence became intimately associated with the captive nations, and sort of like letting them go effectively, which I think probably Kennan would be justly accused of. I wouldn't associate myself with that, but I think I would for instance, a country like Mongolia, just to be candid, I think there's very, very little that we can realistically do to relieve Mongolia's very, very difficult strategic position. So if you're talking about Mongolia, I would say, well, there's things, we may be able to help them here and there, but ultimately there's not much we can do. Probably similar things over the long term in Central Asia. But I'm certainly not prepared to assign to China a sphere of influence over mainland Asia, or I should say Southeast Asia, and certainly not Maritime Asia, which are covered by our defense perimeter. But I think certainly spheres of influence, to the extent that they imply a kind of a political recognition or a sort of formal concession, I don't think we need to be in that business really at all. I mean, I think one of the areas where ideology can be helpful and this is frankly in a kind of instrumental way, is by not giving China a concession to a sphere of influence. I mean, I think one of the things that's sort of a problem with realists, and this would be academic realists, but probably realists of all types, is a sort of a tendency to say, well, if we just understood what Moscow wants and gave it to them, they would be satiated and we could work with them. And I think and actually Wes, my partner, has really influenced my thinking on this point that, sometimes, especially if you look back historically, if you're really looking realistically at how other states make decisions, sometimes you need to be tough or you need to not concede to them. Now, that's where statecraft comes in and sort of the costs and benefits of doing things. But I mean, I don't think we're in the business of saying, oh, well, you just get a free hand in XYZ places and that'll solve all of our problems. We can stand for freedom. We can stand for countries' self-determination. The point I'm making is Americans should not conceive that we need to make sure that Mongolia and the Central Asian states and Afghanistan and so forth are free democracies and so forth, and that's critical to our interests. There are limits on what we should be trying to do. People can donate money and try to help here, supply arms, even these kinds of things. But we need as we embark on this probably long-term strategic competition with China, we need to be careful about the courses we set now as sort of at the beginning, because for instance, if you go back to the history on Vietnam and how we got involved there, I think that a good chunk of it was a result of decisions that were made 15 years, 10 years before, and sort of got locked in. And so I'm kind of very attuned to trying to avoid some of these pitfalls.
Now, one challenge to your perspective might be, arguably because of America's spiritual and religious nature, it tends in its competitions with other nations almost reflexively to see it as a moral, spiritual, ideological challenge. So how do you deal with that aspect of American character that seems to have this almost Manichaean desire?
Yeah, well, this is, as Henry Kissinger puts it, only in America is the term realist an epithet. And I think you're right. Actually, I was debating Aaron Friedberg, professor from Princeton, who has a more ideological view, and he makes this exactly this point, which he says you're not dealing with the Americans as they are. I think Americans clearly have to conceive of themselves in a moral way. And that's probably true of most countries, but I think it's certainly true to us to a greater degree. If you go to the famous book by Walter McDougall, I am in the promised land camp more, at least in terms of how we should, conceive of our moral role in the world, that our primary sort of aspect is to, or a primary mandate is to demonstrate a sort of a moral example, rather than a sort of spread our creed, which, by the way, is contested internally, as you know. And I mean, I think especially in this day and age in which even the most basic American values seem to be under attack domestically, in practice, often the evangelization abroad is not what, I think what certainly you and I would see as what American values are, that's more of an instrumental point, but I think it is important to bear in mind. That said, I think that my approach, the sort of classical realist approach, actually is deeply infused by a particular kind of morality. It is, which is certainly not only compatible, but cognate with certain traditions in Christianity. In fact, in particular, more Augustinian sort of, not to caricature Augustine, who's a very complicated thinker, and I wouldn't pretend to be able to speak to this, the fullness of his theology and so forth, or his political philosophy. But I think it used in a little bit of the simplistic term, is more conscious of the fallenness of the world from a Christian perspective, and the sort of tragedy of acting in the world, and in practice, to use in more contemporary terms, more conscious of the consequences of moral intent rather than the purity of intent. I think that's not the same thing as a purely consequentialist morality, because the nature of government and statecraft is that you're actually acting on behalf of and with consequences for other people. So I think one of the things about, Christianity obviously can never be compatible with a true consequentialist morality. But when you're thinking about the state, you're inherently thinking about the interests of some people as related to other people. And sort of my moral, the sort of burden is primarily on the interests of Americans. And I think we've kind of gotten off of that for the last couple of decades, in particular, this sort of new world order thinking. And I would commend the kind of line of critique of people like Senator Josh Hawley, who I think are kind of trying to reroute our foreign policy in, cui bono, who's good. Well, first and foremost, the republic should be for the benefit of its own people. I mean, that's the function of the republic. That's its moral duty. And it's actually, in my view, it's actually behaving immorally if it's profligate or not seriously considering the consequences of what would happen if, to its people. And I mean, I think the obvious example, of course, would be a very painful example for a concentrated part of our country is, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, if you don't have a clear end goal and a way to theory of victory, and we're still in Afghanistan 20 years later, and some people are still in Iraq, and these are complicated issues, but I don't think those wars were conceived and conducted with the kind of mindset that I'm talking about, to be totally honest, having had some very partial and limited and junior perspective on that. That's part of the reason I think this way, to be totally honest.
Elbridge Colby, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense and co-founder of the Marathon Institute. Thank you for a very insightful conversation.
Thanks, Mark.